Thank you. We're here to demonstrate chainsaw lumber making today, and I'm going to try to walk you through all of the sort of basic steps of turning a nice beautiful log into some usable lumber. So first thing, I've gotten it raised up here on the sawhorses. That gets it to a more comfortable working height. It also makes it a lot easier for one person to manage the log. It'll roll really easily on these sawhorses. If you're just down on the ground, then you're fighting against every rock and root and hollow, and it's a lot tougher to roll it alone. So a few moments getting it up is usually worth the effort. Then, because it was sitting here in a bit of gravel, I just took a wire brush, tried to clean as much gravel as I could. I'll probably end up having to resharpen the saw after I make the cant, so after I cut off all of the bark, then I'll probably have to resharpen anyways if I've gotten into a little bit of gravel, but try to get it as clean as possible. Some folks will use a spud and clean the bark off that way. I find just too time consuming unless the bark's loose already. So I'm going to start by figuring out how to center my, my milled wood inside this log. So I'll determine the difference in the taper between the butt and the tip. Everything gets kind of glued together working with these pines. Don't take your favorite measuring tape. So I've got 21 1/4 inches here. And 21 1/2 inches at the butt. So incredibly almost no taper on this log, 1/4 inch of taper in this dimension anyways. The other dimension might be a little bit different. But essentially no taper, which makes our job just a tiny bit easier here. When I'm milling logs, the first 3 cuts take up about 50% of the time. Once we've got the first 3 cuts done, we've got a square log, then the rest of the cuts, they go really quick and you just start knocking out lots of boards, which is really nice. So the first thing we have to do is take this irregular surface of the rough log, and we have to get a flat plane above it to use as a nice flat reference to run the mill on. So measure down about 1.5 inches. And I'll make a level line. Doesn't need to be level, we just need to ensure that these 2 plates, when I install them, are in the same plane, so level is our easiest point of reference. On the other side, I'm going to do the same thing, drop 1.5 inches down and install my plate, making sure it's level. If there was a difference between my butt and my tip, this is the first time I've had essentially no difference. If there was a difference, then I would drop it farther at the butt to accommodate for that difference so that we're centering right in the log. Just produces a little bit more quality lumber, a little greater quantity of quality lumber. Okay, so I'll drop my rails into position here. If my log isn't well braced, or if it's a smaller log, then adding this weight to one side could roll the log, so I always make sure to have it blocked up. And I'll just check that the rails aren't sitting up on a high piece of bark anywhere. I've got good clearance here. So I'm ready to cut. I've got a big saw because rip cuts take more power than cross cuts, and we're often pulling a big chain. So I've set it down to 5.5 inches right now, which I know with my setup with these rails and plates, 5.5 inches will just clear underneath those plates, but it's good to double check just to make sure I haven't forgotten or made any mistakes. So yeah, I've got a little bit of clearance below the steel plate. Obviously I don't want to hit that, but I'm going to cut from the other side. I always leave the saw idling for a few moments after I finish the cut, give it a bit of time to cool down. And I always make sure to walk it away from this really fine sawdust that rip cutting produces, because that fine sawdust will clog up the air filter quite quickly. This slab isn't particularly heavy. There's not a lot of wood left in it, so I probably won't do anything else with it. If you've cut a really heavy slab, it's not, there's no waste. Just flip it over and you can mill boards off of it as well. But in this case, I don't think it's really worth it, so I'll just set it aside. We use slab for any sort of spaced siding, like woodshed siding. That's great for that. That first cut I made will be the eventual top of our cant. So now I'm going to cut off the sides, and this will determine the width of the boards I'm going to get. So I'm looking for boards that are about 14.5 inches wide. That's kind of about the max that our miter saw is going to comfortably cut, so beyond that just gets kind of a little bit more unwieldy. Again, I've got one more rough surface here. I need to set up those rails to make the cut. Difference is now that I also want this cut to be square to my first cut. So I can use the square against my first cut. Okay, and then we'll go to the other side. got two of our sides squared up here. As I mentioned, getting these three sides squared really takes almost half of the time in milling a log. That fourth side we're actually not going to square up at all. We'll just leave it right to the end. We'll cut our boards off of that fourth side, so it'll just be left as our last bit of waste at the end. And that saves us some time. It also makes it a little bit easier to get the last wood out. So we'll just leave that guy. Now, I'm looking, like I mentioned, for about 14.5-inch boards. And I want those boards to be centered in the nicest wood here, so I can get the greatest number of 14.5-inch boards. So I've drawn a line. You might not be able to see it, but we're quite high of that line. So I wouldn't want, my boards to be centered here because I'd have some wane on some of them. So if I can center them down here, then that's going to be better. So anything outside of that 14.5 inches isn't waste. We'll get boards out of that. We call those second cut or third cut boards, and they're going to be live edge both sides. So you can either use them like that, or I just snap a chalk line, square them up with a circular saw. And I usually do that after, just pile them all up on a sawhorse and then process them later. So I'll drop the saw to 1 inch, and I'll produce a 1-inch board here to get down closer to my line that I was intending to use. On this third cut, we could roll the log 180 degrees. We could set up our square and our rails, and we could square it up that way. But there's actually an easier way to do that, which I'll show once we get down a little bit closer. But for now, just this the flat surface we have becomes the new reference line that we're running the mill on. Oh, beautiful smooth 1-inch board. Obviously it's still live edge both sides, so that one, if I want to use it to square lumber, need a bit more processing. So would just throw it up on a sawhorse, snap a chalk line, and follow that line and give me a fairly square piece. If I needed more square, I could joint it. Now I'm very close to that centered line, so I'll do my bottom cut now. So this is where we can save a lot of time versus rolling the log again. I'm just going to bring the mill all the way up so that my saw, the mill's going to run up here on this flat surface, and my saw will hang way down here to make my cut down there. So there's a limit to how high I could bring up my mill, obviously constrained by the length of the posts here, and that's about 14.5 inches. So so that'll produce for me a 14.5-inch wide cant, which I'll then roll and start cutting 14.5-inch boards off of it. If I wanted a wider cant, 16, 17 inches, then I could roll the log twice and just set up and cut off the top there. But takes a bit more time, and really 14.5 I find is about as wide as we want to be dealing with on a regular basis. So I've got that set up ready to go. I'll just point out before I make the cut that because I've got all this weight bearing down, I'll use the shims. Usually I just put the shims kind of in any old position just to hold the cut open. But in this case, all the weight is bearing right over top my sawhorses. So I'll need to make sure that's where I put the shims. If I put the shim way out here, it's still likely to close up the cut when I try to cut over the sawhorse here. So just take some care to put these shims in the right spot. So I've got a really big heavy slab here that's left over. Again, not waste, just don't want to deal with it now because I want to focus on the log. But I can just start taking boards. I'll probably get a couple of boards there. They'll be live edge both sides and they'll go into the pile to be processed later with the circular saw.